Hi, I'm Anna Wall, student number 258444148. In this presentation, I will critically explore inclusive practices such as adaptive teaching and the graduated approach to support students with special educational needs, in particular those with dyslexia. I will examine existing literature and explore how these theories impact practice to create a supportive and inclusive learning environment, fostering progress for students with SEND, its implication for English and the wider subject range, as well as the efficacy of the methods in addressing the specific learning needs of student X. I will consider how to apply the learnings in my own practice to meet the diverse needs of students with SEND. The definition of dyslexia for the Department for Education is based on the definition provided in Sir Jim Rose's report from 2009. It defines dyslexia as a learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. Snowing and Hume emphasize that dyslexia is a neurological difference that impacts phonological awareness and processing within the brain. Rose also mentions verbal processing speed and verbal memory as elements for dyslexia diagnosis. According to Sally Shaywitz, dyslexia constitutes an isolated cognitive weakness rather than a global impairment. She suggests that the neural systems involved in higher order thinking and reasoning remain intact and in some cases may be even enhanced. Rose mentions co-occurring difficulties, including motor coordination, mental calculation, concentration, and personal organization, but they are not, by themselves, markers of dyslexia. To sum up, Rose, Snelling and Hume and Shaywitz broadly agree that dyslexia is a specific difficulty in phonological awareness that results in reading and spelling issues, rather than a general intellectual impairment. However, the differences demonstrate there is a debate about the contribution of co-occurring cognitive and environmental factors. This underlines the need to evaluate each case individually and to design tailored interventions within the framework of the graduated approach. According to British Dyslexia Association report from 2025, dyslexia affects roughly 1 million school-aged children in the UK classrooms, but many have not been formally diagnosed. It primarily affects reading and writing skills. However, it impacts working memory and the ability to process and retain information. As a result, it can hinder not only the development of literacy skills, but also access to the wider curriculum, contributing to academic underachievement. Given this challenge for working memory, rote memorization and rapid word retrieval are difficult for the dyslexic students. They must understand concept at a fundamental level, which in turn promotes more thorough cognitive processing and deeper conceptual internalization. Although there are strengths associated with thinking differently, the absence of appropriate support can have lasting consequences. Dyslexic young people and their parents report higher rates of mental health difficulties, including anxiety and distress. Literacy difficulties can lead to externalizing behaviors that conflict with school expectations and harm academic progress. Poor literacy and underachievement might be linked to difficulties in post-school life, including employment. Hence, early identification of dyslexia and timely support are crucial to prevent disengagement from education and negative long-term outcomes. Summarized above, the evidence shows that dyslexia as a condition is not linked to intelligence. Consequently, it is not a barrier to achievement in itself. Instead, negative outcomes largely arise from the misalignment between learners' needs and the way the education system works. According to Shaywitz research, given the right support, dyslexic students can overcome their difficulties and thrive in their learning environment and future careers. Student X is a Year 7 student who was diagnosed with dyslexia during his primary school. Despite the challenges presented by dyslexia, Student X remains actively engaged in the classroom and continues to find ways to keep up with his tasks. His primary difficulties stem from processing spoken and written language, word retrieval, and retaining key information. School X supports the student, and the provision includes reading pen, a laptop, and a scriber. Having observed the student during English classes and other lessons, I noticed that a lack of reading and writing skills present a significant obstacle to the student's progress in English and across the board. It resulted in voluntary withdrawal from lessons, insufficient concentration on assigned tasks, and reluctance to participate in assessment to an extent that affects the grades of an otherwise bright individual. Discussion with teachers confirmed that dyslexia significantly affects his achievements across the board, including in maths and science. Student X excels in visual and creative tasks, such as design and technology, food technology, music, and PE. He feels most confident in subjects that involve being outside and making things. Predictably, the least favorite subject is English. The student is fully aware of his issue and is developing strong negative associations with writing, as indicated by his pupil pursuit form. Writing in English and writing in general makes me feel nervous. I struggle with languages in general. I feel less confident about being able to do the work when I need to read and write. Furthermore, Student X's challenges with processing spoken language make certain subjects like Spanish particularly difficult, as they find verbal communication confusing and boring. He can read and interpret text independently, but struggles with spelling. Student X recognizes the impact of his condition across the board, admitting that he finds generating ideas and discussing them exciting. But when it comes to writing, he loses focus and cannot the ideas down. In addition, Student X acknowledges the difficulties with homework when parents write for him. A general decline in the pursuit of personal objectives can be observed as well. For example, his EHC plan from primary school states becoming a marine biologist as a primary career goal. At the moment, he has decided that this cannot coexist with his condition and shifted to a less academic career, such as plumbing or construction. This reflects how dyslexia affected his confidence and sense of worth. The SEND Code of Practice 2015 remains the principal statutory guidance for SEND provision in the UK, outlining the legal duties for local authorities and educational organisations. Central to the code is early identification of needs and timely intervention, as well as the graduated approach based on a person-centred framework. Tailored support involves young people and their families collaborating with professionals in education, health, and social care to make decisions together. It identifies dyslexia as one of the specific learning difficulties. The SEND Code describes the graduated approach as a continuous cycle of 4 stages: assess, plan, do, review, adjusting provision at each stage. This approach is effective for students with dyslexia, whose support requirements can shift significantly as they develop. The government has published a new white paper, Every Child Achieving and Thriving. The policy paper makes it a statutory requirement that every child with identified SEND has an individual support plan, which outlines student needs, provision, and outcomes, and is developed collaboratively with parents and children and is reviewed regularly. It specifies 3 levels of support available to SEND students, identify access to specialist support, advocates creating inclusion bases and expert at hand service, which aims to make SEND provision more accessible. School X inclusion policy is based on 3 main legislative documents: SEND Code of Practice, the Children and Families Act of 2014, and the Special Educational Needs and Disability Regulations of 2014. The Children and Family Act strengthens the principle outlined in SEND Code of Practice and recognizes that dyslexia is a special need and results in a greater difficulty in learning. Children have the right to request EHC plans and receive provision. The Special Educational Needs and Disability Regulation outline procedures for creating the plan. School X SEND policy is presented in 3 main documents: SEND policy from 2025, SEND information report, and the accessibility plan. The Inclusion Department monitors the student progress throughout the year by assessing, discussing, and reporting students' progress 3 times. It specifies the types of intervention available for SEND students, including literacy intervention based on students' reading age. It outlines the adaptation of the curriculum and learning environment that we are going to analyze later, and the use of a graduated approach based on assess, plan, do, review cycle to remove or reduce any obstacle to the student's learning. Student X's case documented in his EHC plan and pupil passport is consistent with dyslexia, highlighting spelling and writing difficulties, working memory difficulties, and visual motor coordination difficulties, which affect his writing fluency and the legibility of his writing. Student Access Passport specifies the strategies to improve his learning outcome. They include the repetition of learning points to strengthen retention in working memory. The increased processing time reduces cognitive load, allowing Student X to decode text and interpret instructions at his own pace. Chunking information breaks complex concepts into manageable chunks to avoid cognitive overload and increase retention. A sequence of short instructions breaks a complex task into small logical steps that are easier to follow, and this fosters independence. Student X has time-out card for his emotional regulations as well. The graduated approach was introduced as a key framework outlined in SEND Code of Practice. Its 4 stages, assess, plan, do, review, allow schools continuous monitoring of progress and adjustment of provision in order to meet students' evolving needs. The Education Endowment Foundation guidance aligns with the logic of the graduated approach, outlining evidence of its positive impact on students with SEND. It highlights that support provision is assessment-driven, suggesting that targeted support informed by ongoing assessment is more likely to improve outcomes. Similarly, Greenwood and Kelly argue that this cycle ensures rigorous monitoring of progress and appropriate intervention, and allow for thorough evaluation of the impact of those interventions. This is particularly relevant for the students with dyslexia, as their development is not linear, and student needs vary in development patterns over time. Thus, regular assessment and review will allow refining strategies such as scaffolding, time adjustment, multisensory input, or assistive technology. I have observed that the access to assistive technology is monitored and organized by the Inclusion Department across School X. They also provide targeted support, including short-term SEND provision to remove or reduce obstacles to student learning, and specialist support when it is required. Inclusion supports the vital connection between school and home, ensuring that students' and parents' or carers' views are incorporated into EHC plans. They create and review pupil passports, informing day-to-day teaching practices. I observed how the strategies such as scaffolding, dual coding, continuous monitoring, time adjustment, increase ratio are firmly embedded in planning throughout different subjects. The implementation was discussed at a staff briefing during autumn term and supervised by the Inclusion Department. Drilling down to the level of the individual student, I observed spelling practice in Student X's class. It was combined with retrieval practice and was embedded in the lesson structure. Several target words were practiced, but written one at a time. This appeared to be designed to reduce cognitive load for Student X, ensure his minimal participation in writing in order to develop confidence. However, without clear evidence that this practice is systematically planned, reviewed, and adjusted within the cycle of Access, Plan, Do, Review, and without formal literacy intervention support, its impact on his underlying difficulties is likely to remain limited. Dong et al. Support these doubts, stating that structured, graduated frameworks are necessary but not sufficient. Impact depends on teachers having the capacity and freedom to adapt teaching based on ongoing assessment, rather than treating frameworks as rigid procedure with careful progress monitoring and adapting instructions in response. And this brings us to the concept of adaptive teaching. Adaptive teaching can be defined as a teaching process in which the teacher uses ongoing assessment to modify explanations, tasks, support, and classroom organizations. Davis et al. Advocate droning on a wide range of evidence-informed strategies because a combination of strategies produces more powerful effect than a single strategy solution. This multi-method approach is particularly relevant for students with dyslexia who require explicit, systematic instruction in reading and spelling, as well as access strategies, for example, use of assistive technology or scaffolding. However, while combining strategies is conceptually attractive, left without dyslexia specialist input, it might result in an unstructured, eclectic approach. This raises a question whether adaptive teaching alone can guarantee that students with different needs and starting points will achieve the same shared high expectations within whole class teaching without specific intervention. Formative assessment and adaptive teaching are intrinsically linked. According to William, formative assessment, assessment for learning, is a process of collecting information about students' current understanding, while adaptive teaching is the process of adjusting instructions, explanations, tasks in response to that information. So, assessment provides the evidence for adaptive teaching that follows. This dependency also exposes potential weaknesses. Formative assessment, when done superficially, might not provide enough evidence for efficient adaptation, leading to false positive for those whose processing difficulties might be less visible. Because of this, teachers' capacity to interpret and respond to the evidence becomes critically important. This underscores the importance of high-quality teaching as a factor underpinning the learning process and achievement. Slater et al. Show large differences in teacher effectiveness, proving that high-effective teachers make greater gains. These indicate that the quality of teaching strongly influences students' attainment. Hence, teachers' training and ongoing CPD are important contributors to developing high-quality classroom practice that support the success of the whole educational system. SchoolX's approach to adaptive teaching is outlined in the School SEND policy, and it includes RED review, which means revision with knowledge organizer and personal learning checklist. The teachers aim to increase the ratio during the classwork. The responsive teaching involves regular checking, correcting and challenging, as well as explicit teaching of reading and vocabulary and modelling. Student responsibility means a gradual increase in student independence through effective moduling and gradual release of responsibility. It also includes adapting resources using assistive technology and all other specific SEND support strategies, for example, giving longer processing times, pre-teaching of key vocabulary, reading instructions aloud. Student X has regular staff briefings to introduce and practice all the recommendations above. For example, the autumn term was focused on increasing ratio in the classroom, the use of knowledge organizers and checklists, and how to incorporate metacognition in the classroom by, for example, narrating the thought process or assessing the existing knowledge and displaying the success criteria. For student X, adaptive teaching is clearly visible. Teachers are using questioning, success criteria, assistive technology and feedback. All of that reflects the school policy and the wider literature. However, the mixed result highlights that adaptive teaching is not just about adding strategies, but about how they are connected through formative assessment and teacher capacity. William framed formative assessment as assessment for learning, but if teachers do not have time to analyze evidence in depth, adaptations might remain superficial. The geography example, where student X perceives improvement with laptop, but teachers cannot confirm this, illustrates a gap between pupil experience and data-informed evaluation. This reinforces my earlier point that the impact of adaptive teaching depends on an interaction among tools, such as assistive technology, the quality of assessment information, and systemic constraints such as funding and staffing. In other words, the strategy set is strong, but the underlying condition for consistently effective adaptation are only partially in place for student X. In conclusion, dyslexia remains a persistent issue affecting the learning and educational outcomes of a large proportion of students in the UK. As a complex and well-described difficulty, it might have co-occurring issues, but it is not linked to intelligence. Many dyslexic learners can excel with appropriate support. Overall, the evidence suggests that SchoolX's policies align with the national framework outlined in the said Code of Practice, and that the whole school use of adaptive classroom strategies and graduated approach is evident. The persistence of significant writing difficulties and the geography example with its mixed results demonstrate that assistive technology on its own, as well as the whole school implementation of adaptive teaching and graduated approach, they are insufficient solution for dyslexia. There are systemic constraints that limit the effectiveness of support for student X. The reliance on a strict reading age threshold for access to literacy intervention, driven by funding and capacity, means that dyslexic learner with clear ongoing difficulty is excluded from the specialist provision. This highlights a broader systemic problem. Underfunding results in the absence of dyslexia-specific intervention, risking that persistent literacy difficulty will go unaddressed and limit long-term aspirations. How can I adapt my practice in order to support student X? First of all my experience highlight the need to introduce short and regular elements into the lesson, focusing on specific difficulties of dyslexic student. For example, spelling or one-sentence writing, prioritizing those over task completion. Retrieval practice on mini whiteboard should be one-word answer to encourage participation and make it accessible. I should explicitly teach one of dyslexia-specific element, for example, spelling. Show the word on the board, break them into syllables, highlight tricky parts, get all the students to use them in sentences and read the sentence to the partner. I should use color coding, then modeling analytical paragraph to shift the focus from the density of the text to the ideas. Student X works well with ideas, hence it might trigger the thinking flow and gloss over the difficulties of writing. In general, focusing on the content might be the key for student X. When offering sentence stems for writing, I should ask him to say them first and only after that write it down. This might reduce the cognitive load of thinking and writing at the same time. Next step is going to be tracking the impact of the adaptation and deciding what success looks like. Hopefully, it will help me to assess the efficacy of the intervention and decide on the next steps. Improving teacher-student communication by routinely inquiring what helped him in the task and compare his perception with my impression will help me to use this as an evidence and adjust the support. In case classroom evidence shows that student X's progress is insufficient, I should use this evidence to advocate his case upwards and request specialist intervention. Thank you very much for your attention.